The morning Fannie Hale threw a bucket of well water over the head of the Durango County cattle auctioneer for trying to shortchange her on 20 head of prime Hereford. Every soul in Caldwell, Kansas knew that no man alive would ever be fool enough to court her, and most of them were relieved about it. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a cattleman's brow, trembling with the energy of drives coming up from Texas and the distant rumble of commerce that smelled equal parts of money and manure. The town had grown fast and hard, the way frontier towns did, with a main street of weatherboard storefronts and a saloon on every other corner, and a church squeezed apologetically between two of them. Dust was the permanent fifth season in Caldwell, settling on windowsills and eyelashes, and the collars of men who thought themselves important. Fannie Hale ran the Hale Quarter Circle Ranch on the South Fork of Bluff Creek, and she ran it alone. She had been running it alone for 3 years, ever since her father, Clarence Hale, had gone out to inspect the eastern fence line on a January morning and never come back, found 2 days later by a neighbor's boy, his heart simply having stopped somewhere between one step and the next. Her mother, Ruth, had followed him into the earth 6 months after that, the doctors saying it was pneumonia, but everyone who knew Ruth Hale knowing it was grief pure and simple. Fannie had been 22 years old and suddenly the sole proprietor of 400 acres, a weathered ranch house with a sagging porch, 11 horses, 43 cattle, 2 border collies, and a reputation for plain speaking that had already begun to precede her into rooms she had not yet entered. She was 25 now, and the reputation had only grown. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall in her worn leather boots, with copper-red hair that she pinned up each morning with the focused efficiency of someone who refused to allow a single unnecessary thing to slow her down. Her eyes were the gray-green of sage after rain, and they had a directness to them that made less confident people look away first. She was not what the women's magazines of the era would have called delicate or fashionable, but she was striking in the way that a well-made tool is striking, purposeful, and exactly fitted for the life she lived. The men of Caldwell and its surrounding territories had tried, in their various ways, to court her. Dale Pruitt, who owned the feed store and had a pleasant face and reasonable manners, had lasted 2 weeks before Fannie informed him crisply that if he intended to continue leaving her farm ledger open and reading her accounts without asking, she would need him to leave and not return. He had gone red as a beet and not returned. Hank Sorensen, a rancher from the north end of the county with a good spread and 3 grown children who needed a stepmother, had proposed marriage over Sunday dinner at the Caldwell Hotel and had received in return a calm and thorough explanation of exactly why she was not in the market for a ready-made family, and a man who had said during the soup course that he believed women were unsuited to financial decisions. Young Thomas Waycross, who was a deputy sheriff and genuinely sweet-natured, had attempted to give her advice on how to handle a land dispute with her neighbor, Orville Gluck, and had found himself gently but firmly shown the door of her kitchen when it became clear that his advice amounted to telling her to give Gluck the 2 acres he was claiming rather than make trouble. She had made trouble. She had hired the best land attorney in Wichita, a man named Henderson who cost her 3 months of egg money and 2 weeks of sleep, and she had won the 2 acres and Gluck's grudging respect, though never his friendliness. It was after the Gluck dispute that people in Caldwell began saying, not unkindly but with a kind of resigned certainty, that Fannie Hale was too stubborn for any cowboy in the county, that she would live and die on that ranch alone, talking to her dogs and her horses, and that this was probably fine because she seemed more genuinely satisfied in her solitary arrangements than most married women appeared in theirs. Fannie herself was aware of what people said, and she did not exactly mind it, but on certain evenings when the Kansas sky went that impossible color between rose and gold, and the prairie stretched out to the horizon like a promise that someone else would collect, she felt the particular ache of a life that was full in nearly every respect except one. She would not admit this to anyone. She was not sure she admitted it fully to herself. But the ache was there, real as the calluses on her palms. Joseph Ellsworth arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late October of 1878 with a grulla mule named Amos, a roan horse named Captain, $300 in cash money, a letter of introduction from a ranching association in Colorado, and an expression of mild, interested patience that seemed constitutionally incapable of becoming either panic or impatience. He came from Pueblo, Colorado, originally, though he had spent the last 2 years working cattle drives from Texas up to the railheads in Kansas, learning the land and the trade, and the particular kind of philosophy that develops in a man who spends months at a time with nothing for company but sky and cattle and the slow turning of stars. He was 29 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who live outside, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were the color of cloud cover at elevation. He had a square jaw and large, capable hands, and a way of listening to people that made them feel, somehow, that what they were saying was the most reasonable thing anyone had ever said, even when it was not. He had come to Caldwell because there was a ranch for sale on the north end of Bluff Creek, a modest affair of 230 acres with a sound barn and a house that needed work, and because a man he trusted named Pete Calloway had told him that the grazing in the Bluff Creek Valley was as good as anything in southern Kansas. He had not come to meet anyone. He had not come looking for a woman. He had come because a man of 29 who had been drifting long enough begins to feel the pull of ground he can call his own, and because the particular brand of loneliness that belongs to the wandering life had begun, quietly and without drama, to get old. He rode into town on a Tuesday morning, Amos plodding along behind Captain with his customary expression of philosophical indifference to everything the world offered. Amos was a legendary mule in the sense that everyone who encountered him agreed he was both the most useful and most infuriating animal they had ever dealt with. He would carry tremendous loads without complaint, pick his way across terrain that would terrify a horse, work from sunup to long after sundown without faltering, but he would not be rushed. He would not be led where he did not wish to go. He could not be frightened into compliance or tempted into hurry. He had opinions about which paths were acceptable and which were not, and he communicated these opinions through the full weight of his body placed firmly at the spot where the road diverged, and no amount of pulling or cajoling would move him until he had considered the matter to his satisfaction. Joseph had never found this particularly frustrating. He found it, if he was honest, companionable. He understood stubbornness as a philosophy. He had a fair amount of it himself, though his variety was quiet and gradual rather than spectacular. He stopped first at the land office, where a man named Fetter gave him the papers on the North Bluff Creek property and took his earnest money with the pleased efficiency of a man finalizing a deal he had been trying to close for 2 seasons. He stopped next at the general store, run by a woman named Mrs. Clarabelle Hutchins, who had the sharp eyes and comprehensive social knowledge of someone who had lived in a small town for 40 years and paid close attention to every minute of it. "You looking to settle out on the Pendleton place?" Mrs. Hutchins asked, wrapping his purchase of coffee and salt pork and flour with the precise economical movements of long practice. "I am," Joseph said. "It'll need work on the east side of the house. I saw that. You know ranching well enough." Mrs. Hutchins studied him with the frank appraisal of a woman who made it her business to know what kind of person had come to town. "You married?" "No, ma'am. You'll want a wife eventually." "Running a ranch alone is work for 2 people. "Yes, ma'am. We have eligible women in this county," she said, in the tone of someone presenting inventory. "I appreciate knowing that." "Fannie Hale is the most capable woman in this valley," Mrs. Hutchins said, shifting into a more specific gear, "but I'll warn you fairly that every man who has tried to court her has come away regretting the attempt. She is not what you would call accommodating." Joseph paid for his goods and lifted the package from the counter. "What's her ranch like?" Mrs. Hutchins blinked because that was not the response she had been expecting. "Well run," she said after a moment. "Very well run, in fact. Her father was a good rancher, and she took to it even more naturally than he did, most people think." "Interesting," Joseph said, in the tone of someone genuinely finding something interesting. He thanked her and carried his goods to Captain, and Amos watched him with an expression of mild skepticism that was simply his resting face. The first time Joseph Ellsworth saw Fannie Hale in person was 3 days after his arrival in Caldwell, at the Thursday morning livestock market on the edge of town, where farmers and ranchers brought animals to trade and sell, and buyers came down from Wichita and up from Texas, and the whole complicated commerce of frontier agriculture played out in a chorus of lowing cattle and haggling voices. Fannie was in a disagreement with a buyer. It was not a dramatic disagreement, not yet, but Joseph could see it building the way you can see weather building on the prairie, that particular quality of the air that tells you something is coming. The buyer was a thick-necked man in a good coat who kept talking over Fannie's responses, and Fannie was listening to him with the contained patience of a kettle on a hot stove, and her border collie, a black and white dog she called Pepper, was sitting at her heel with an expression that mirrored his mistress's exactly. "The going price for these heifers is $11 a head," the buyer was saying, "and that's fair market and you know it." "The going price," Fannie said, with the calmness of someone who has checked their arithmetic 3 times, "for quality Hereford heifers of this age and condition is $13 a head, and I have a letter from the Wichita market report of last week that I am happy to show you if you'd like." "Now, Miss Hale, Mrs. or Miss is fine," she said. "But what isn't fine is being offered $11 for $13 cattle. If you'd like to discuss the actual market rate, I'm available. If you'd like to waste my morning, I have other business to attend to." The buyer sputtered. Joseph, who had been standing 15 feet away watching a different transaction that no longer held his attention, felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. It was not exactly admiration, though there was admiration in it. It was more like recognition, the sense of encountering something that matched the frequency of something inside yourself. He did not approach her then. He was not the kind of man who acted on impulse in situations that deserved consideration. He went home to the Pendleton place, his place now. He was beginning to think of it, and he repaired the east wall of the house with lumber he had bought at the mill, and he thought about the woman with copper hair and gray-green eyes and the clear, uncompromising voice. He thought about her for 3 days, which was about as long as Joseph Ellsworth ever needed to think about anything before deciding what to do about it. On Sunday, he rode Captain to the church on the main street of Caldwell, which was a Methodist congregation of about 60 souls who sang with variable enthusiasm, and listened to their minister, a round-faced man named Reverend Ash, with the respectful patience of people who need their Sundays to include something other than work. He saw Fannie come in with a neighbor woman named Dolores Fry and sit 2 rows in front of him, and he sat through the service paying perhaps less attention to Reverend Ash's sermon on the parable of the talents than the Reverend would have hoped, and afterward he maneuvered, with what he hoped was natural-seeming casualness, to be near the door when she came out. "Miss Hale," he said. He had learned her name from Pete Calloway, who had written ahead and told him everything about Caldwell, including the fact that the best ranch in the South Fork Valley was run by a red-haired woman who took no nonsense, and that Joseph ought to introduce himself if he had any sense. She looked at him with those direct gray-green eyes. "I don't know you," she said, which was not hostile, simply factual. "Joseph Ellsworth. I bought the Pendleton place last week." Something shifted in her expression, a slight recalibration. "The North Fork property, that's the one. It needs work on the east side." "I've been working on it," he said, and then, because he could tell that she was already beginning to calculate how to excuse herself from a conversation that she expected to be like all the other conversations men tried to start with her, he said simply and without any particular performance, "I heard you at the livestock market Thursday. You were right about the price. She studied him. You were there, near enough to hear. Did you have an opinion about it? My opinion is that you had your facts correct and he was hoping you'd be too polite to use them. A pause, very brief. He was, she said. Did he come up to 13? 12.50, I took it. The cattle needed to move. Still better than 11. Considerably, she said, and for just a moment the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. She looked at him with slightly less assessment and slightly more simple curiosity. What brings you to Caldwell, Mr. Ellsworth, beyond the Pendleton place? I've been driving cattle up from Texas for 2 years, he said. I wanted ground of my own. The North Fork has good graze. I noticed your South Fork. Better graze than the North, actually, she said, and this was just plain honesty, not competition. The creek runs truer on the south side and the grass holds longer into fall. I'll come look at it sometime if you don't mind the company. She looked at him steadily. We'll see, Mr. Ellsworth, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was not a no. She turned and walked back toward her wagon, and Pepper the border collie fell in beside her like a small black and white shadow. Dolores Fry, who had been standing nearby talking to the Reverend's wife, and had heard the entire exchange with the alert interest of a woman who serves as the neighborhood's primary source of social information, watched Joseph watch Fannie go. And then she watched Joseph's face, and what she saw there was something she had not seen on the face of any of the other men who had tried to court Fannie Hale. It was not the expression of a man who had encountered an obstacle. It was the expression of a man who had encountered something interesting. She mentioned this to her husband Carl at Sunday dinner, and Carl said he hoped the man knew what he was getting into, and Dolores said she thought perhaps that was exactly the point. The following Wednesday, Joseph Ellsworth appeared at the fence line of the Quarter Circle Ranch at 10 in the morning with Amos in tow and a fair question about the South Side graze. He had not technically been invited, but he had been told, "We'll see." And he had decided that in the absence of a definitive no, reasonable initiative was appropriate. Fannie was mending fence on the east pasture when she saw him coming, and the first thing she noticed was the mule, which was the most magnificently indifferent animal she had seen in some time, picking its way along the road with the measured deliberation of a judge walking to the bench. The second thing she noticed was that Joseph was not hurrying it. Most men would have been yanking at the lead line or cursing. Joseph was simply riding captain at a pace that suited Amos, reading what appeared to be a folded newspaper. She said nothing for a moment when he stopped at the fence, just looked at him. "Morning," he said, folding the paper and tucking it into his coat pocket. "Your mule sets his own pace," she said. "He does, always has. I stopped arguing with him about it about 2 years ago." "Most men don't stop arguing," she said. "Most men waste a lot of time," he said pleasantly. He looked out at the south pasture, which was indeed rich and golden in the October light, the blue-stem grass deep and thick despite the lateness of the season. "This is good ground. I told you it was. You did." He swung down from captain and stood at the fence with his hands on the top rail, not presuming to open it, just looking. She watched him look. He had the easy physical competence of a man who had spent years doing hard outdoor work, the kind of competence that doesn't perform itself but simply is. "How many head are you running right now?" 53. "I'm selling down to 40 for winter. Feed cost gets difficult above 40 on this acreage. You supplement with hay, cut it from the creek bottomland in August. 3 cuttings this year, which was good. Last year only 2. He nodded. They talked about grass and cattle, and the particular challenges of Kansas winters for another 20 minutes, and Fannie found herself talking the way she talked to her father's old friend Pete Harkin, who ran a ranch west of town, and was the only person she regularly talked ranching with easily, specifically, without having to translate anything for someone who didn't know the subject. Joseph knew the subject. He asked good questions and listened to the answers and didn't try to correct her on her own land, and this was so refreshing that she almost felt suspicious of it. "What do you need for the North Fork to get through winter?" she asked, finally. About 12 tons of hay I haven't cut yet and a repaired barn roof. The hay meadow on the east side of the property is overgrown, but it's there. I'll cut it late. Late cutting gives you lower quality. I know it. It's what I've got, she considered. My bottomland meadow has a section I usually leave uncut to let it recede for next year. But if you wanted to make a trade, your labor on the fence line repair on my north boundary, which needs work, for the right to cut that section, it would benefit us both. He looked at her steadily. That's a fair offer. I try to make fair offers, she said. I don't always get them in return, but I try to make them. I noticed that at the livestock market. You were paying attention. I generally do, he said. She opened the fence gate, which was not an invitation for anything except business, and showed him the north boundary that needed mending, and they walked it together with Pepper ranging ahead of them and Amos and Captain following behind with the companionable ease of horses and mules who have been introduced properly. It was a practical morning with a practical purpose, and Fannie kept it exactly that way, and Joseph did not try to make it anything else. But when he left at noon, touching his hat brim in a gesture that was respectful without being fawning, she stood at the fence for a moment after he was gone and felt something she did not quite have a word for. It was not the ache she sometimes felt at sunsets. It was something different. It was more like the feeling before a change in weather, electric and alert, and not entirely comfortable. She went back to mending fence and told herself it was nothing. He came back on Friday to start work on the north boundary fence, as agreed. He brought his own tools and his own wire and worked steadily through the morning without requiring her attention or conversation, which impressed her more than she expected. Most men who came to her property needed managing. Joseph Ellsworth managed himself. By noon, he had repaired 40 feet of fence in a way that was noticeably better constructed than her own previous work on that line, which she examined when she brought him a cup of coffee at midday with the critical eye of someone who took pride in good workmanship. "That's a solid post set," she said, handing him the cup. "Thank you." He drank the coffee and looked at the fence line ahead. Another 2 afternoons should finish it. "Take what you need," she said. She almost said something else, something about how there was cornbread from breakfast if he was hungry, and how a man working on her property might as well be comfortable, but she did not say it. It felt like too much too soon. She went back to her own work. He came back Monday and finished the fence. She brought coffee again, and this time there was cornbread with it, set matter-of-factly on a plate without comment because it would have been wasteful not to. He ate it and said it was the best cornbread he'd had since Pueblo, Colorado. And when she asked about Pueblo, he told her about growing up there, about his father who had run a small cattle operation, and his mother who had been a school teacher, about the mountains you could see from the front porch on clear mornings like pale blue promises, about the particular way the cold came down from the Rockies in winter like something alive and purposeful. He talked about it without nostalgia or longing, the way people talk about places they have made peace with leaving, and she found herself listening with more absorption than she intended. She told him, in return, about her father, about how Clarence Hale had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1861, a young man with seed money and enormous optimism, and had built the Quarter Circle Ranch from raw prairie over 15 years. And how he had taught her to rope and cut and read cattle and negotiate with buyers and manage accounts, while her mother Ruth had taught her to sew and cook and sing hymns, and how she had taken to her father's lessons more naturally than her mother's, though she was grateful for all of them. Did he mind? Joseph asked. That you were more interested in ranching than needlework. She considered the question, because she had never been asked it quite that directly. He was pleased, she said after a moment. He told me once that a ranch needs someone who understands it and cares for it, and that he was glad I was that person because he wasn't sure what would happen to it otherwise. I think he knew, even before he died, that he wasn't going to be here to see it grow old. The heart trouble had been there for a year. And you've run it alone since. For 3 years, yes. He looked at her with those gray eyes that did not offer pity, which she would have resented, or admiration in the kind of exaggerated way that implied surprise, which she also would have resented, but simply acknowledgement. The look of a person recognizing the weight of something and not flinching from it. "It's a good ranch," he said. "He built something worth building." "He did," she said. "I intend to keep it that way." She stood and took the plate inside before she said anything else, because she was beginning to feel unsteadily fond of this conversation, and she was not yet sure what to do with that. In November the weather turned, as Kansas weather does, with sudden and decisive authority. The sky went the color of pewter, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a day, and the first hard frost came, painting every grass blade with silver. Fannie worked through it with her usual focused efficiency, moving cattle to the south pasture, where the windbreak of cottonwood trees along the creek offered some shelter, checking water troughs morning and night, laying in extra bedding in the horse stalls. Joseph came by twice that first cold week, once to return a borrowed tool, and once for no reason she could immediately identify, though she realized after he left that he had spent most of the visit checking her livestock without comment, with the quiet assessment of an experienced rancher noticing things, and that the fence gate on the north pasture that had been sticking had stopped sticking, which meant someone had rehung it while she was not watching. She found this profoundly irritating, and also, she admitted privately, touching. Dollar's Fry came to visit the following Saturday with a jar of apple preserves and the focused energy of a woman who has a topic to discuss. "Joseph Ellsworth," she said, setting her jar on Fannie's kitchen table with the deliberateness of placing a chess piece. "He bought the Pendleton place," Fannie said, pouring coffee. "He's been here 4 times in 3 weeks. He's done work on my north fence in exchange for hay cutting rights. It's a business arrangement." Dollars looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been married for 20 years and is thus entirely immune to innocent explanations. "Fannie Hale, that fence has been done for 2 weeks. Fannie set down the coffee pot. "He stops by. He does, and what do you talk about? Ranching, cattle prices, weather. What else?" A pause. Fannie sat down across from her friend. "His family, Colorado, my father, things." "Things," Dollars repeated with enormous satisfaction. "Fannie, Dale Prout talked to you about his store inventory and you threw him out. Thomas Waycross talked to you about his cousins in Missouri and you fell asleep. You are now voluntarily talking to Joseph Ellsworth about things." "It's different," Fannie said, and hated herself slightly for saying it because it was exactly what Dollars wanted to hear. "How?" She picked up her coffee cup. "He listens when I talk, actually listens. Not waiting for me to stop so he can say something, but listening. And he doesn't try to fix anything that isn't broken. When I told him about the ranch accounts last week, he didn't tell me I was doing them wrong or that I should hire someone. He asked me what ledger system I was using." Dollars was quiet for a moment. "That's remarkable," she said, and she meant it sincerely. "I know," Fannie said, and her voice was quieter than she intended. It was Dollars who said, gently, "Are you going to let yourself like him, Fannie?" "I don't know yet," Fannie said, and this was the most honest thing she had said to another person in a very long time. The thing that changed between them happened on a Tuesday in the middle of November, and it happened because of Amos. Fannie had gone north along the creek to check on a section of fence near the property line, the one that bordered the Gluck place, because she did not trust Orville Gluck to be respectful of boundaries even after the legal matter had been settled. She had ridden her mare, a bay named Pearl, and she had left Pepper at the ranch because Pepper had cut her paw on a piece of wire and needed rest. She was alone, which was not unusual, when she came around the bend in the creek and found Joseph Ellsworth standing in 6 inches of creek water in his boots trying, with considerable patience and 0 success, to get Amos to cross to the far bank. The mule was standing in the water with the immovable certainty of a boulder, ears set at an angle that communicated his thorough and final position on the matter of crossing that particular stretch of creek on this particular day. "How long has he been like that?" Fannie asked, pulling Pearl up at the bank. "About 40 minutes, Joseph said, without embarrassment. He was soaked to the knee and his expression was one of philosophical resignation. He objects to something about the far bank. I haven't identified what. What's on the far bank? The north section of my property. I need to check the fence. Fannie got down from Pearl and tied her to a branch and walked to the edge of the creek and studied the far bank carefully. After a moment she saw it, a section of exposed tree root that the recent rains had washed free, jutting from the bank at an angle that would be invisible to a person, but would be immediately apparent to an animal with Amos's particular attentiveness to footing. "There's a root," she said, pointing. "He thinks it'll catch his hoof." Joseph looked. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "Can you go downstream 20 feet? The bank is clear there." Joseph looked at Amos. He turned toward downstream. Amos, without being asked, turned with him and walked 20 feet downstream and crossed the creek without hesitation, stepping onto the far bank with the dignified composure of an animal that has been entirely correct all along. Joseph looked back at Fannie from the far bank. The November light was low and gray, and the creek moved silver between them, and his boots were soaking wet, and he was smiling, which was not an expression he wore often but wore well, the kind of smile that belonged in the landscape of his face as naturally as the creases at the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," he called. "He's a good mule," she called back. "He just needed someone to listen." Something moved across Joseph's face that was not the smile but was related to it, something deeper and more personal. He tipped his hat. She turned back to Pearl, and her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. They rode the fence lines together that afternoon, his on the far bank, hers on the near, moving in parallel along the creek, close enough to talk across the water when they wanted to, and far enough apart to be doing their own work. It was an arrangement that suited both of them with no discussion required, which was itself remarkable. He asked her across the silver creek in the gray November light whether she ever thought about expanding the herd. "I think about it," she said, "but expansion without the hands to support it is just creating problems. I can't manage more than 55 head alone, not during calving season." "You don't have any help at all." "I hire a boy from town for the 2 worst weeks of calving and for the fall gather. Otherwise I manage." "I respect that," he said. "It's not respectable," she said honestly. "It's just what is. I'd hire a full hand if I could afford one consistently. I can't yet." "Yet," he said, and there was something warm in the word, some notice taken of it, some recognition that yet was a word that looked toward the future. "Yet," she agreed. They were quiet for a stretch, just the sound of hooves on soft ground and the creek running and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk high up in the pale sky. "Joseph," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, which they both noticed. "Yes," he said. "Why haven't you asked me to dinner or tried to bring me flowers or any of the things men generally try?" He considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I didn't think you'd want flowers," he said. "And I reckoned that what you'd actually be interested in, if you were interested at all, was a person worth talking to. So I tried to be that first." She looked across the creek at him for a long moment. Pearl shifted under her and the hawk called again, and the whole wide Kansas afternoon held its breath. "You reckoned right," she said. "The first time he came to dinner at the Quarter Circle Ranch was in late November, and it was Fannie who asked him, with the practical directness that was her nature. "I'm making beef stew Sunday evening," she said, when he stopped by Thursday to return a borrowed hacksaw. "It's too much for one person, if you want to come." "I'll bring biscuits," he said. "You can bake." My mother was a school teacher and she had opinions about what skills were necessary for a person. Baking was on the list. "Then yes," she said. "Bring biscuits." He came Sunday with biscuits that were excellent, golden and tall and slightly buttered on top, and the dinner was the kind of meal that settles into the bones and stays there. They ate at the kitchen table while the wind moved around the house outside, and the stove threw good heat, and Pepper lay in her corner with her bandaged paw and the 2 dogs, her other collie named Chief, sprawled between the table legs like a rug with ambitions. They talked for 3 hours after the dishes were done. They talked about ranching and about the railroad's effect on cattle prices, and about whether Caldwell would still matter in 10 years when the trails moved west. They talked about books. She had a shelf of them her mother had brought from Ohio, and he had read most of the same ones in the kind of scattered, determined way that people read when books are scarce but necessary. They talked about the Comanche removal to the reservation at Fort Sill, which had happened just a few years before, and Fannie said quietly that she thought the whole history of what had been done to the peoples who had lived on this land first was something that would follow the country for a long time, and Joseph agreed with her without qualification, which was not a position all men of his time were willing to take plainly. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he put his hat on at the door. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "Thank you for the biscuits," she said. They were standing close in the doorway, not quite touching, the cold air coming in around him from outside. She could smell the cold on his coat and wood smoke and something underneath that was simply him. "Fannie," he said, "yes. I think you are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time." She looked up at him. He was several inches taller and said, "I think that's probably the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me." He smiled, that rare good smile. "Good night." "Good night, Joseph." She stood in the doorway until his lantern disappeared into the dark, and then she stayed a moment longer, feeling the cold air and the stars and the enormous Kansas dark, and something that had been tight in her chest for 3 years loosened, just slightly, like a knot given the beginning of slack. December came in with a blizzard that was the worst in 4 years, 3 days of driving snow and wind that turned the world into a white roaring nothing and kept everyone inside by necessity. Fannie weathered it well because she had prepared for it, her cattle sheltered and her hay stored and her firewood stacked to the eaves of the woodshed. She worried briefly about the North Fork and whether Joseph had had time to finish the barn roof repairs before the snow came. On the 4th day, when the storm had blown out and left the world crystalline and silent under 2 feet of snow, she hitched her old draft horse Duncan to the sledge and drove north along the creek with a covered pot of soup and no particular explanation for herself except that it was neighborly. Joseph's barn roof had not been finished. She could see the problem from 100 yards away. The northwest corner had partially collapsed under the weight of snow, and the sound of it was the sound of something ongoing and worsening. She found Joseph already up on the roof despite the cold and the ice, wearing 2 coats and moving with careful deliberateness across the damaged section, and she tied Duncan to the post and climbed up after him without asking. He looked up when she appeared at the eave. He did not tell her to go down or say it was too dangerous or any of the things she had been told by men in her life when she was doing something they thought she shouldn't. "The ridgepole is cracked," he said. "I need someone to hold the support brace while I nail the splice." "Tell me where," she said. They worked for 2 hours in the bitter cold, her holding braces and passing tools and calling measurements down from her angle, while he hammered and spliced and lashed with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this kind of emergency repair before. Her fingers went numb inside her gloves, and her boots slipped twice on the ice shingles, and once Joseph caught her arm with a quick, sure grip that prevented a fall and then let go again, clean and businesslike. When the roof was sound, they got down and went inside the barn, which was warm with the body heat of his horses and Amos, and 3 other animals he had acquired since the fall. Fannie's soup was still warm enough to eat, and she had brought 2 tin cups, and they stood in the barn aisle eating soup in the barn warmth while their breath showed in the cold and the horses moved placidly in their stalls. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," she said. "I brought soup." He looked at the cup in his hands and then at her. "Fannie, don't make it more than it is," she said quickly, and then stopped because she was not sure that was what she meant. She tried again. "I mean, yes, I came because I was worried. That's true, I'd have come for any neighbor. But you came for me specifically." She held his gaze. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the barn the Kansas winter lay white and absolute, the sky a pale blue that contained no warmth at all, and inside it was warm and golden and smelled of hay and horses and soup, and everything felt very particular and real. "I think," he he said carefully, "that I have been falling in love with you since that Thursday morning at the livestock market." The barn was very quiet. "You don't know me," she said, but her voice was not dismissive. It was almost wondering. "I know enough," he said. "I've been making it my business to know enough. You are stubborn and capable and honest, and sometimes you are kind in ways you don't want anyone to notice. And you know cattle prices within 2 cents, and your cornbread is the best I've had in 4 states. And you read 3 times as fast as I do, and you cry when you talk about your father and try not to, and I think," he said, and his voice had something stripped bare about it, something that took courage, "that you are exactly the kind of person worth building a life with." Fannie set down her tin cup on a nearby rail very carefully because her hands were not entirely steady. "I'm difficult," she said. "People say so. I've heard that. I don't compromise well on things that matter. There do I. I will never be the kind of woman who defers to a man just because he's a man." "I know it," he said. "Good. My mule is stubborn too. It'd be lonely otherwise." The silence that followed was soft and warm like the barn itself. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come to Caldwell with a grulla mule and gray eyes and the particular patience of someone who had learned that the best things take the time they take, and she felt the loosened knot in her chest come fully free. "You are," she said slowly, "the most unusual man I have encountered in 25 years of encountering men." "I'll take that," he said. She crossed the 3 feet between them, which was the most decisive movement of her life to that point, and she kissed him, briefly and deliberately, the way she did most things, with full intention and no particular ceremony. He was still for one surprised moment, and then his hands came up and held her face with the careful tenderness of someone handling something precious, and the kiss became something less brief and more complex, and the horses moved in their stalls, and the winter stayed outside where it belonged. January and February of 1879 were the months in which Fannie Hale and Joseph Ellsworth learned each other with the thoroughness that characterizes people who do not fall in love lightly or quickly, and who, having fallen, intend to do it right. They learned each other's working rhythms. That Fannie was an early riser who had done 2 hours of work before breakfast, and that Joseph was also an early riser, but needed coffee before he was fully functional, a thing she found amusing and accommodating in equal measure. They learned each other's stubbornnesses. That Fannie would not be told how to manage her accounts even by someone she trusted, and that Joseph would not be hurried in his decisions even by someone he loved, and that these qualities in each other were more complementary than conflicting, the way 2 different strengths in a team of horses pull together rather than against each other. He came to the Quarter Circle Ranch 3 times a week, and she rode north to his place twice, and the road between the 2 ranches along Bluff Creek became a path worn comfortable by familiarity. They worked together on his ranch and hers with the easy, wordless coordination that comes when 2 capable people respect each other's competence and stop wasting energy on hierarchy. He did not tell her what to do on her ground, and she did not second-guess his decisions on his, but they talked everything through together, which was better than either of them working alone had ever been. Dollar's Fry came to call in late January and found the kitchen at the Quarter Circle cleaner and warmer than she had seen it in 3 years, and a pair of man's work gloves on the chair by the door, and Fannie's expression altered in a fundamental way, not softer exactly, but opened somehow, like a window that had been stuck and was now allowing light. "You're happy," Dollar said, with the particular wonder of someone seeing something they had begun to doubt was possible. "Don't make me admit it out loud," Fannie said, putting coffee on, but she was smiling. "I won't," Dollars promised, and then immediately said to her husband Carl when she got home that Fannie Hale was the happiest she had ever seen her, and that Joseph Ellsworth must be something genuinely extraordinary. Carl said he hoped the man knew what a lucky thing had happened to him, and Dollars said she thought perhaps he did. The trouble with Orville Gluck began in February, which was the kind of thing that happened in the history of the Hale Ranch with the reliability of bad weather. Gluck had never entirely forgiven Fannie for the land dispute, which was unjust but predictable, and he had spent the 3 years since finding small ways to make her life difficult, letting his cattle graze across the fence line, blocking the access road to the eastern pasture with equipment left conveniently in the way, telling anyone in Caldwell who would listen that she was running her operation incorrectly. These were nuisances rather than crises, and Fannie had managed them with the same patient determination she applied to everything. But in February, Gluck filed a complaint with the county land office claiming that 3 acres of Fannie's south pasture, the best 3 acres, the ones with the creek frontage, had been improperly surveyed when her father had purchased the land in 1865, and that the true boundary ran 20 yards north of where the fence stood. It was not an honest claim. It was the kind of claim that a man makes when he has enough money to make legal trouble and enough resentment to want to, knowing that a woman running a ranch alone might not have the resources to fight him properly. What Gluck had not factored in was that Fannie was no longer running the ranch alone in any meaningful sense. Joseph heard about the filing from Pete Calloway in town and came to the quarter circle that evening with his jaw set and his eyes very still in the way they went when something had roused his quiet anger. "Henderson," he said, when Fannie told him she already knew about it. Henderson was the Wichita attorney who had won her the 2-acre case 3 years before. "I've already written him," she said. "Good. What else do you need?" "I need the original survey records from the state land office in Topeka." "Henderson will need them to counter the claim." "I can ride to Topeka," she looked at him. "It's 2 days each way in February." "I know it. You'd do that." He met her eyes. "Of course I would. Fannie, what's yours should stay yours. That's not even a question." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something she had been thinking for several weeks and had not said because she was still measuring the shape of it. "What's mine and what's yours are going to be the same thing eventually, aren't they?" It was not quite a question. Joseph set down his coffee cup with the deliberateness of a man giving a moment the weight it deserved. "I've been intending to ask you something on that subject," he said carefully. "I've been thinking about how and when, and I hadn't settled on it yet. But if you're asking, I'm asking," she said. He stood up from the table, and she stood up from her chair, and they were close in the warm kitchen with the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the cold February night pressed against the windows. And he took her hands, those capable, calloused, work-worn hands in his. "Fannie Hale," he said, "I would like to spend every day of my life working alongside you if you'll have me. I would like to know your opinions and argue with you when I think you're wrong and discover that I'm wrong half the time and be grateful for it. I would like to watch you read your books in the evenings and hear you sing when you think no one is listening. You do sing. I've heard you through the kitchen window, and I would like to build this life with you properly. I would like," he said, "to be your husband if you'll marry me." Fannie looked at their joined hands and then up at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was close to them. "You heard me singing," she said. "You have a good voice. I sound like a fence hinge." "A very musical fence hinge," she laughed, and the laugh was the most unguarded sound he had ever heard from her, full and genuine, and she said, "Yes, Joseph, I'll marry you. But I want to keep the quarter circle as its own thing, legally separate at least to begin with, because I need to know that what I've built here is mine and not just absorbed into something larger. Is that acceptable to you?" He did not hesitate. "Completely acceptable. They're neighboring operations and we run them together, but the titles stay as they are until you say otherwise." "Then yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He kissed her in the kitchen with the winter outside and the stove warm and Chief and Pepper alert at their feet. And it was a different kind of kiss than the one in the barn, deeper and more deliberate, the kind of kiss that is making a promise. He rode to Topeka in February in temperatures that made the road a misery, and came back with the original survey records, which showed conclusively that the boundary was exactly where Fannie's fence stood, and that Gluck's claim was founded on a deliberate misreading of a secondary marker that had been moved at some point, by whom was strongly implied though not provable. Henderson took the records and filed the counterclaim, and the county land office dismissed Gluck's complaint in March, and Orville Gluck drove past the Quarter Circle Ranch for the next 6 months without looking toward it, which Fannie found to be an entirely satisfactory outcome. They were married in April of 1879 at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, on a morning that the Kansas sky decided to perform at its absolute best. A blue so clean and deep it looked painted, with a warm wind coming up from the south that smelled of coming green things. Reverend Ashe performed the ceremony with evident satisfaction, as clergy always feel when two people who are clearly suited to each other finally get around to the official arrangements. Dolores Fry cried, which everyone expected. Her husband Carl shook Joseph's hand with both of his, which was more demonstrative than Carl usually got, and suggested he meant it. Pete Calloway, who had come down from Colorado specifically for the occasion, sat in the front row with the pleased expression of a man who gave good advice and had been proven right. Fannie wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter months, not the white of conventional fashion, which would have been impractical and slightly absurd for a woman who spent her days in a working ranch, but a rich, real color that suited her copper hair and gray-green eyes. She carried no flowers. She carried instead a small sprig of sage from the creek bottom, because the smell of sage after rain was her favorite thing in the world, and it seemed right to carry something real. Joseph wore his good coat and a new shirt, and his boots clean to a shine that Amos viewed with some skepticism when his owner passed the tie post before the ceremony. He had no ring to give her, yet rings were an expense he hadn't managed, but he had carved a simple band from a piece of antler he had found on the creek bank, sanded smooth and fitted to size, and Fannie wore it on her left hand with the same matter-of-fact pride she wore everything that was honestly come by. She had a small silver ring made later in the summer, when the cattle sold well and there was money for it, and she gave the antler one to Joseph, who wore it on a cord around his neck for the rest of his life. The reception was held at the Caldwell Hotel, whose proprietors, a German couple named the Baumgartners, provided a meal that fed 40 people and asked no payment beyond what it cost them, because they liked Fannie and thought she deserved a celebration. There was fiddle music and someone brought a harmonica, and the hotel's small dining room became something warm and celebratory that lasted until the evening stars appeared. Fannie danced for the first time in 4 years, because dancing had felt frivolous when she was managing a ranch alone, and there was no one she wanted to dance with. Dancing with Joseph was different. He was not a particularly graceful dancer, he admitted this freely, but he moved with the same confident physicality he brought to everything, and he held her with the sureness of someone who intended not to let go. "You're stepping on my feet," she told him during the second reel. "I know, I warned you I wasn't graceful. You did warn me. I thought you were being modest." "I never claim skill I don't have," he said, entirely sincerely, and stepped on her foot again. And she laughed again with that unguarded fullness that he had decided was the best sound in the world. They spent their wedding night at the Quarter Circle Ranch, which was the obvious choice since the North Fork house, though sound now and well repaired, was smaller and less comfortable, and the Quarter Circle was simply home. Joseph brought his personal things, books, tools, his father's old compass, a few pieces of furniture he had made himself, and set them alongside Fannie's, and the house absorbed his presence the way a house absorbs the presence of someone who belongs in it, with a natural rightness that required no adjustment. Amos moved to the Quarter Circle barn, where he and Pearl regarded each other with mutual respect for 2 days, and then settled into the quiet camaraderie that characterizes animals who have decided each other is acceptable. Chief and Pepper rearranged themselves around Joseph's addition to the household with the fluid adaptability of dogs, and within a week, the daily life of the Quarter Circle Ranch had reconfigured itself around 2 people as naturally as water finding a new level. The summer of 1879 was a good one by Kansas standards. Enough rain, not too much heat, grass holding green longer than usual into August. The cattle did well, and the hay cutting was abundant. And for the first time in 3 years, Fannie had someone to share the weight of a calving season, which made the difference between exhaustion and something close to manageable. Joseph took the North Fork property on a running lease to a family named the Crowleys, who had come out from Missouri and needed ground to get started on, paying a fair rent that covered the property taxes and contributed to a savings that he and Fannie kept in a lock box under the kitchen floorboard, and talked about with the cheerful precision of people planning a future with actual materials. They talked about expanding the Hereford herd incrementally. They talked about whether it was worth pursuing the water rights on the east branch of the creek. They talked about a better windmill to replace the old wooden one that had been creaking ominously for 2 seasons. They also talked about children. This was a conversation that had the quality of something both of them had been carrying separately and were glad to finally carry together. Fannie wanted children. She had wanted them for a long time. Privately, in the part of herself she did not expose to the world that had spent 3 years assuring itself she was fine alone. She wanted someone to teach what her father had taught her, and what her mother had taught her, and what she had learned herself in 3 years of running 400 acres with nothing but her own competence and determination. She wanted the house to be louder. Joseph wanted children with the simple straightforwardness that characterized most of what he wanted. He thought the Quarter Circle Ranch was exactly the right kind of place to raise them. He thought Fannie was going to be a remarkable mother, though he kept this opinion to himself because he suspected she would find it either alarming or sentimental, and he wasn't sure she was ready for either. In December of 1879, Fannie told him she was expecting their first child, standing in the kitchen on a cold morning with her coffee cup and a faint expression of something that was equal parts joy and apprehension, and the particular determination of a woman who is going to do this thing properly whatever it costs. Joseph sat down at the table, quite suddenly, as if his legs had decided to express his feelings for him. He looked up at her. He said simply, "Fannie." "I know," she said. "When?" "July, I think. Mrs. Hutchins will know better than I do. I'll ask her." He stood up and came around the table and held her for a long moment in the cold kitchen morning. Not dramatically, not with any of the performances of emotion that novels might suggest, just held her with the steady solidity of someone who is exactly where they intend to be. She let herself be held, which was itself something she had learned to allow, not a surrender but an acceptance, the recognition that leaning on someone who is strong enough to hold you is not weakness but sense. "Good," he said into her copper hair. "It will change everything," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Good." Their son was born in July of 1880 on a hot Kansas night, with the crickets making their summer racket outside the bedroom window and Mrs. Hutchins, from the general store, serving as midwife with the capable efficiency of a woman who had brought 23 children into the world in Caldwell and knew exactly what she was doing. Joseph sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours and then was told he could come in, and he came in and found Fannie propped on pillows with a small red face, wrapped in a piece of the blue wool she had not used for her wedding dress, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has just done something extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily worthwhile. "He has your eyes," she said. The baby had, at this early stage, the indeterminate blue-gray eyes of most newborns, which would settle eventually into a clear, pale gray that was unmistakably his father's. But Joseph looked at his son and felt something move through him that was beyond any experience he had vocabulary for, something ancient and enormous and quiet. "What shall we call him?" Fannie asked. They had discussed names. They had not quite settled. Joseph looked at his son and then at his wife and said, "Clarence, for your father." She was quiet for a moment. Her hand tightened on the bundle. "Clarence Joseph Ellsworth," she said, trying the shape of it, "if you like." "I like it very much," she said, and the brightness in her eyes this time was genuinely tears, though she blinked them away with characteristic efficiency. "Come and hold him." Joseph sat on the edge of the bed and took his son in his arms for the first time, and Clarence Joseph Ellsworth regarded his father with the serious, unfocused gaze of the very newly arrived, and Joseph held him with the careful sureness of those large, capable hands and thought that this particular moment in this particular warm room in Kansas in the summer of 1880 was the thing everything before had been moving toward. Caldwell changed, as frontier towns do, in the years that followed. The cattle drives that had made it matter were already beginning to shift westward as the homesteaders pushed the open range further out, and the town was converting itself from a raw trail head into something that aspired to permanence: more brick buildings, a real schoolhouse, a second church, a new land office with glass windows. The Kisham Trail itself would be effectively closed to large drives by the mid-1880s as the farmer settlers fenced the land with barbed wire and the railroads pushed further south, and Caldwell would reinvent itself, as the towns that survived always did. Fannie watched this with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who understood that land and economies both change, and she planned accordingly. The quarter circle began shifting emphasis from the cattle drives toward a breeding operation for quality Hereford stock bulls and heifers sold to other ranchers building their herds, which was a more stable business than the trail driving market as the trails closed. Joseph contributed what he knew from his cattle drive years: which markets were hungry, which breeds were gaining favor, which ranchers in the region were worth dealing with. And together they built a customer list and a reputation for quality stock that spread from Caldwell across the southern half of Kansas. Joseph's North Fork land, after the Crowley family moved on to their own purchase 3 years later, became part of the quarter circle operation properly. The fence lines between the two properties were gradually eliminated, and the 630 acres of combined ground became the thing they had both been building toward without quite saying so. Fannie drafted the paperwork that combined the land titles herself, after consultation with Henderson in Wichita, and she did it in her own way and on her own timeline, which was the right way. Clarence grew into a serious, observant child who had his father's patience and his mother's practical intelligence, and who at the age of 3 could identify cattle by their markings, and at 4 had convinced Amos to follow him across the barnyard by offering the mule a piece of carrot with a focused intentionality that his parents found both alarming and deeply characteristic. Amos, by this time, was showing the dignified age of a mule who had been well cared for and had strong opinions about his own welfare, which in his case meant he was in excellent health and more opinionated than ever. He and Clarence developed an understanding that baffled everyone who witnessed it. The mule would follow the boy, load willingly for the boy, cross creek crossings he had previously refused for the boy, all with an equanimity that he never extended to any adult human except, on his best days, Joseph. "Your son has a gift," Joseph said one October afternoon, watching Clarence lead Amos across the south pasture with the unhurried confidence of a child who has never occurred to himself to be afraid. "He gets it from you," Fannie said. "You're the only other person Amos has ever decided to respect. I did very little to earn it. You stopped arguing with him," she said. "That's everything with a mule like that. You stopped trying to make him into something he wasn't and just let him be what he was." Joseph looked at her sidelong with that rare good smile. "I am a man of deep philosophy," he said. She laughed and bumped his shoulder with hers. "You are a man who was standing in creek water for 40 minutes when I met you," she said. "I was going to get there eventually," he said. "I know, you always do." Their second child came in 1883, a daughter they named Ruth, for Fannie's mother, with her mother's copper hair and her father's gray eyes, and a disposition that was entirely her own, warm and sociable in a way that was different from both parents, the kind of child who made friends in 30 seconds and never seemed to run out of them. Clarence took his sister's arrival with the grave acceptance of a child who has been told something important and has decided to treat it accordingly. And by the time Ruth was 6 months old, he was following her around the house in a supervisory capacity that the adults found both sweet and unnecessary. The ranch ran better than it had ever run, which was saying something given how well it had run in its previous incarnations. There was a drought in 1884 that tested everyone in Caldwell and the surrounding county. 2 months without meaningful rain in the driest summer in a decade. The grass going brown in July when it should have been green. The creek dropping to half its normal level. The cattle losing condition faster than feed could replace it. Fannie sold down the herd strategically before the worst of it, keeping the quality breeding stock and letting go of the animals that would cost more to carry than they were worth. Joseph made 3 trips to Wichita during the drought, selling hay to their neighbors at fair prices when they ran short, which they could do because they had overstocked the hay barn in the good years. It was hard. It was the kind of hard that frontier life was always capable of delivering, the kind that took everything you had and gave you back the measure of what you were made of. They went through it the way they went through everything, working alongside each other, talking through every decision, disagreeing sometimes with real heat, and working through to the other side of the disagreement, and holding each other at the end of days that had asked too much, in the dark bedroom with the Kansas night outside and the children sleeping down the hall. Orville Gluck sold out that summer and moved to Missouri, which Fannie noted with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has outlasted something that once tried to beat her. The Gluck land was bought by a young family named Pierce, who turned out to have 3 children Clarence's age and a wife named Margaret who became one of Fannie's closest friends in the years that followed. The drought broke in September with 3 days of steady rain that turned the creek full again, and the grass tentatively green at the roots. And Fannie stood in the yard in the rain with her face up and her eyes closed and felt, for the first time since June, that everything was going to be all right. Joseph came and stood beside her in the rain without an umbrella or a coat, which she noticed and said nothing about, just stood there beside him in the downpour, feeling the water on her face and the solid reality of him beside her. "We made it through," he said. "We did," she said. "We're going to be okay." "We were always going to be okay," she said, with the quiet certainty of a woman who has survived enough to know what she can survive. It was never really in question. He took her hand in the rain and held it. By 1886, the Quarter Circle Ranch had a reputation that extended well beyond Caldwell and well beyond Sumner County, which was the county Caldwell sat in. Ranchers from across Kansas and into Colorado and Nebraska came to the Quarter Circle to buy breeding stock, because the quality of the Ellsworth Hale Herefords, they had never quite settled on a single name for the operation. Using both with the cheerful informality of a couple who had stopped caring about the official version, was consistently excellent, and the prices were consistently fair, and Fannie's knowledge of bloodlines and breeding patterns was the kind that serious cattlemen recognized and respected. She had earned this knowledge the same way she had earned everything else, by reading everything she could find on the subject, by watching and recording and analyzing her own outcomes over years, by corresponding with breeders in England who had been working Hereford lines for generations, and who responded to her carefully written letters with the respectful engagement due a colleague, some of them surprised when they eventually met her to find that their American correspondent was a woman, and all of them, after 5 minutes, no longer surprised. Joseph ran the breeding records alongside her and managed most of the actual cattle work, the physical labor of the ranch, which was considerable, and handled the negotiations with buyers, which he was good at in a different way than Fannie was good at it. Where she was precise and factual and implacable, he was easy and patient and warm, and together they covered every variety of buyer perfectly. Clarence, at 6, was already showing the makings of someone who would belong to the ranch as naturally as his mother did. He had his mother's gift for assessment and his father's patience, and he spent his days in the way of ranch children, seriously, purposefully, learning by doing and watching and doing again, moving through the landscape of the quarter circle with the belonging of a person whose identity is inseparable from a place. Ruth, at 3, had decided her primary interests were talking and the kitchen, two things her mother was willing to accommodate within the reasonable bounds of a working day. She talked with the flow of a creek that had found its proper channel, and she learned, with Fannie's guidance, the kitchen skills that Ruth the elder had once taught Fannie, the baking and the preserving, and the management of a household that worked as a serious enterprise rather than an afterthought. Joseph taught both children to ride, beginning with the oldest and working through the stages with the calm, unhurried methodology of a man who learned from Amos that the best approach to teaching was patience and consistency, and never more pressure than the situation required. Amos himself, by 1886, was somewhere in his middle 20s and had achieved the status of a kind of family institution. He was slowing, not dramatically, not enough to limit him significantly, but perceptibly, the way very old creatures slow with a dignity that asks to be respected. He had earned every foot of the south pasture, and every piece of carrot Clarence brought him, and he grazed in the afternoons with the composure of an animal that has worked hard and knows it, and has been given the right conditions for his age. Joseph spent extra time with Amos that summer, not because the mule needed it practically, but because he was aware that the long life of a well-kept mule would still eventually end, and he wanted the time. He groomed him and talked to him in the way of people who talk to animals without expecting answers but find the conversation useful, and Fannie watched this from the kitchen window, sometimes with the particular affection that comes from seeing someone you love be tender with something they love. The spring of 1887 brought two things of significance to the Quarter Circle Ranch. The first was the completion of the new barn, larger and better built than the original, with stalls for 20 horses, a proper hay loft that held 6 months of feed, and a well-fitted tack room that Fannie had designed herself with the same careful attention to function that she applied to everything. It had taken 2 seasons of planning and 1 season of building, with Joseph doing most of the construction and hiring 3 men from town for the heavy work, and when it was done, it stood at the end of the ranch lane with the solid permanence of something built to last a century. The second was that Fannie was expecting their 3rd child. She was 34 years old, which was not young by the standards of the era for a 3rd pregnancy, and she went through this one with rather less equanimity than the previous 2, simply because she was tired and the ranch was busy, and the new barn construction had taken considerable management energy. Joseph took on extra in the household without being asked, cooking, which he did competently if not brilliantly, and managing the children's mornings, and taking the dawn cattle check so Fannie could sleep an extra hour, and all of this was done with such matter-of-fact naturalness that she did not have to feel managed. "You're doing too much," she told him one evening in February, sitting at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of her and the lamplight warm on the page. "I'm doing what needs doing," he said from the stove where he was making coffee. "I'm not an invalid. I know you're not. I'm doing it because I want to, not because you can't." He brought the coffee and sat across from her and looked at her with those gray eyes that always saw her clearly without reducing her. "There's a difference." "I know there is," she said. "Thank you." Their 3rd child, a boy they named Thomas for no particular ancestor, but because both of them liked the plainness of it, the way it sat in the mouth without pretension, was born in April of 1887, during a spring storm that rattled the new barn windows and made the cottonwoods along the creek sound like the sea. He came into the world red-faced and immediately opinionated, and Fannie held him with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and felt, nonetheless, that particular freshness of a new person arrived. Joseph sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son and his other 2 children, who were permitted into the room once Thomas was cleaned and settled, and the whole of it, the warm room, the rain on the windows, The family that had grown in this house from 2 people and 2 dogs into something larger and more complex and more thoroughly itself, was almost more than he could hold. "You look like you might cry," Fannie told him, with the affection she had stopped pretending she did not feel. "I might," he admitted. "Ellsworth men cry," she said. It was gentle teasing, the kind between people who have been long enough together to know all the tender places. "Occasionally," he said, "when things are very good." She reached out and took his hand and held it, and Clarence and Ruth looked at their new brother with the assessing eyes of children deciding where a new thing fits in the order of the world. "He's very small," Clarence observed. "You were very small," Fannie told him. "I don't remember that." "You were the smallest thing I'd ever seen," Joseph said, "and now look at you." Clarence stood straighter, pleased, and Ruth reached out a single careful finger and touched Thomas's cheek and said, with enormous solemnity, "Hello." Thomas blinked. "He likes me," Ruth announced. "He probably did." Amos died in the autumn of 1888, on an afternoon in October when the Kansas sky went that impossible color between rose and gold that Fannie had always thought of as the color of ache. He went peacefully, in the south pasture, lying down in the bluestem grass in the warm afternoon light, as if he had simply decided that this was a good place and a good time, which was a thoroughly characteristic decision for a mule who had always managed his own affairs. Joseph found him when he went out for the evening check, and he stood in the pasture for a long time in the October dusk with his hand on the mule's gray side, not crying but very still in the way of a man experiencing something that words are inadequate for. Fannie came out when dinner was ready and found him there and came and stood beside him without speaking, and they stood together in the fading light until the first stars appeared. "He had a good life," she said, finally. "He did," Joseph said. "He was a good animal. He was the best kind of stubborn," she said. "He always knew what he was about." Joseph looked at her in the last of the light. "He did. He always knew what he was about." They buried Amos at the edge of the south pasture, near the creek where he had spent so many afternoons grazing, and Clarence, who was now 8 years old and had understood Amos better than most adults, put a piece of carrot on the ground at the spot, which was the most honest memorial that could have been offered. The 1880s rolled toward their end, and Caldwell continued its transformation from wild trail town into something more settled. The saloons did not entirely disappear, but the churches multiplied, and the school expanded, and the streets that had been dirt were beginning to get plank sidewalks, and the kind of raw energy that had characterized the town in its boom years was converting into something more domestic and less dramatic. This suited Fannie and Joseph well, because what they were building was also less dramatic and more domestic than it had once needed to be, not in the sense of being less meaningful, but in the sense of having found its level, the particular depth of a life that knows what it is and no longer needs to prove it. The Quarter Circle Ranch was a well-established breeding operation by 1889, with a customer base that kept the business running in good years and lean, with 3 children who were growing with the confident purposefulness of young people who know their place in the world, and with a reputation in Caldwell and the surrounding county that bore no resemblance to the one Fannie had once carried, not because she had changed, but because the people around her had finally understood what they had been seeing all along. Dolores Fry, who remained one of Fannie's closest friends through all of it, said one afternoon over tea in the Quarter Circle kitchen, the same kitchen where Fannie had learned to cook from her mother and kept her father's accounts and fought her first land battle and begun to fall in love with a man who came with a stubborn mule, that she thought Fannie Hale was the most contented person she had ever known. "That's a strong word," Fannie said, pouring more tea. "You are, though. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, and you know it." Fannie considered this. Through the kitchen window, the October afternoon was gold and blue and vast, and across the yard she could see Joseph showing Thomas, who was now 2½ and deeply interested in anything large, the workings of the water pump, talking to the boy with the patient particularity of a man who takes small people seriously. Clarence was somewhere in the south pasture with the 3-year-old heifer he had been given the responsibility of training, and Ruth was at the Pierce house next door, where her 3 friends would already be waiting for her in whatever elaborate domestic game they had been constructing all week. "I am," Fannie said, after a long moment. Not defensively, not triumphantly, just plainly, the way she said most things. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And then she brought the tea to the table and sat down across from her oldest friend and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and the October afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor the way good time moves, slowly and without urgency, the way you want it to when you know you are in something worth staying in. In the spring of 1890, Fannie Hale Ellsworth planted a kitchen garden bigger than any she had attempted before: tomatoes and beans and squash, and 3 kinds of pepper, and a long row of sunflowers along the fence, which she had never planted before, and which her mother Ruth had loved, and which now, at 37, she was ready to plant without feeling it was frivolous. She planted them on a warm April morning, with Thomas sitting in the dirt beside her, learning the names of seeds with the concentrated seriousness of a child who has decided this is important. Joseph came out at midday with bread and cold chicken for their lunch and found her in the garden rows, upright on her knees, soil on her face and in her copper hair, which had 1 strand of silver in it now, which she was entirely indifferent to explaining to Thomas the difference between a bean seed and a squash seed with the precise, engaged attention she had given to every important thing in her life. He stood at the garden fence and looked at her for a long moment, the way he had first looked at her from the livestock market fence in the October of 1878, with the sense of encountering something at the exact right frequency. She looked up and saw him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, thinking. "What about?" He opened the fence gate, her fence gate, the one he had rehung quietly on a cold November day 12 years ago, and came into the garden and sat down on the turned soil beside her and Thomas, who looked at the bread with focused interest and then at his father. "I was thinking," Joseph said, "that I have everything I want." Fannie looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had always seen clearly. "You were thinking that in a garden in April," she said. "I have been known to think large things in small moments," he said. "That is true," she said. Thomas reached for the bread. "He needs lunch," she observed. "We all need lunch," Joseph agreed, and tore the bread and handed pieces to his son and his wife, and kept a piece for himself. And the 3 of them sat in the April garden in the Kansas sun, with the smell of turned earth and the creek running in the distance, and the sunflower seeds waiting in the ground to become something brilliant in July. The quarter-circle ranch would run, in the hands of Fannie and Joseph Ellsworth, for another 30 years from that April morning, growing and adapting through the changes that came to Kansas and to ranching and to the country itself. Clarence would take it on eventually with the competence of a man who had learned it from people who knew it deeply, and Ruth would marry a practical, good-humored man from Wichita and visit every summer with her children, and Thomas would spend his life alternately ranching and pursuing an enthusiasm for the natural world that his parents encouraged with complete sincerity. The story of Fannie Hale and Joseph Ellsworth was told in Caldwell and beyond for years, not in a legendary or inflated way, but in the practical, affectionate way that communities tell the stories of people they have been proud to have among them. They told it the way Dollars Fry first told it, which was essentially the truth, that there was a woman who was too stubborn for every man in the county, and then there was a man who showed up with a grulla mule and no interest in changing her and every interest in knowing her, and that the stubborn woman and the patient man had built something that lasted, and had been happy in the building of it, which was not as common a thing as it should have been. And the mule, people always said when they got to that part of the story, they always mentioned the mule, because it was Amos really who had done it. Amos standing in the creek with his ears set and his position final, and Fannie reading the bank and telling Joseph where to go instead, and Joseph listening, because he had long since learned that the best things happen when you stop fighting what is and start working with what is actually in front of you. On winter evenings, years into their life together, they sat by the kitchen stove, the same stove, or one that replaced it, in the same kitchen with the same window looking out over the same yard toward the same creek, and they talked and read, and were quiet together with the ease of two people who have nothing to prove to each other and everything to enjoy. The children's voices came from other rooms, or later from other houses, and the ranch was quiet in the way a ranch goes quiet at the end of a day that has been properly used, and the sky over Kansas was enormous and full of stars that had watched over this particular piece of ground long before anyone came to claim it, and would be there long after. Joseph Ellsworth, who was not given to speeches or unnecessary declarations, said once on a February evening when the snow was deep outside, and the kitchen was warm, and Fannie was reading by the lamp with her reading spectacles, which she had acquired at 40, and wore with the complete unself-consciousness of a person who has decided that what she needs she will simply use, that he thought the best thing he had ever done was not argue with Amos. Fannie looked up over her spectacles. "If I had argued with him," Joseph said, "if I had insisted on that crossing, I would have been on the other side of the creek when you rode up, and we might never have talked, or it might have gone differently. The whole thing might have been different." "It might have been," she agreed. "So the mule saved us," he said, in a manner of speaking. Fannie considered this with the same careful honesty she had applied to everything for 50 years. "The mule knew what he was about," she said finally, "and so did you." Joseph smiled. "Eventually." "Yes," she said, "but you got there." And she went back to her book, and the fire burned warm in the stove. And outside the Kansas stars turned overhead the way they always had and always would, indifferent and magnificent, over the ground that she had fought for and built upon and loved, over the life that she had made exactly on her own terms with the one person in the world who had thought that was exactly right.